At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
The numbers of fallen from the Great War are impossible to grasp. Numbers that multiplied day after day, year upon year, as the military offensives came and went. A father, a pitman, a son, a schoolteacher, a shopkeeper. These were not saints or noble leaders. Most were the everyday folk who made their communities work. Once the war was over, those same communities made the solemn promise that is reiterated every November. We will remember them. We, in the 21st century, have lived with the memorials of the Great War all our lives. We pass them daily. In the pre-mobile phone era, they were convenient meeting places, somewhere locally that everyone knew, but possibly paid little attention to. To understand why these monuments and the associated scrolls and plaques exist, why the largest cities, down to the smallest hamlets, felt the need to create them, is a truly foreign country, and one not easily navigated. Records can assist in research, and we can only attempt to put ourselves in the place of those that were left behind. The War Office, guided by Major Fabian Ware, the man tasked with creating the war cemeteries, had made the painful yet understandable decision not to bring the fallen home, but instead to leave them amongst their comrades on the field of battle, ultimately cared for by the Imperial, later Commonwealth, War Graves Commission. This decision left communities back home with no physical evidence of their sacrifice, other than the void left by the countless members of their community who would never be seen again.
Well, British society hadn't been exposed to huge losses in major European wars up to this point, and British society had never had to mobilise the number of men, both in absolute and in relative terms, that it had to mobilise in the First World War. So the experience of a war on this scale, a ground war on this scale, fought particularly in Europe, is novel for British society.
It meant that the people back home couldn't grieve because part of the process of overcoming bereavement is burying your dead and paying your last respects. The war memorial became a surrogate tombstone where people could go when the mood took them, special days, you know.
It was something tangible. When you haven't got a grave and you haven't got a body and you haven't got anywhere to go and remember people, it offers that. It's a sort of surrogate grave for people, I think, and that must have been very important, and somewhere to lay flowers.
Streets got together, little communities got together and started writing out rolls of honours, which sometimes are the pre-runner for the war memorials. Using local friends, through newspapers or communication, they used to ask, is he served, is he going? That's how they were compiled locally. So that's why you get difference in names, you know, nicknames. Joseph, Jazz, things like that. That's why it's different, that's why it's difficult.
That it was a time where people wanted a permanent reminder of what they had sacrificed. Not only their children, but themselves, that they had given up their children.
I think also perhaps it served to make them feel that the sacrifice wasn't all in vain. If something rather splendid stood there to record the death of their family member. Otherwise, you know, think, well, there's nothing, is there? So maybe it served to do that as well, to justify it in some way.
The northeast of England has had a reputation for hard living and heavy industry. While the last century has seen this evolve and much of the heavy industry disappear, immediately after the Great War, this reputation was still, broadly speaking, accurate. The coals went from Newcastle, the new ships sailed out of the Tyne and the Wear, and people between the Tweed and the Tees fed the furnaces, filled the wagons, farmed the land, and worked a life that bound them to their locality. Travel had broadened the mind with Victorian railway expansion, but predominantly people were born, worked and died within the same small area. People knew each other, people shared their lives with each other, and after the war, people grieved with each other. The picturesque village of Branspeth, just outside Durham, is representative of the smaller northeast communities.
It was a very feudal village because Lord Boyne owned the castle. His family had been there for 100 years or so. Nearly everybody in the village worked for him, either on the estate or farms that he owned. Mostly things like stonemasons, carpenters, plumbers, painters, gardeners, domestic gardeners, obviously men working on the farms, vast numbers looking after horses as well as, well, it's labour intensive in those days, yes. I think you get the impression that the women didn't actually have employment at that time, they were just running the home, although some of the daughters I think were in service. But it was a very tight-knit community because everybody worked together, they socialised together, a lot of them went to school together in the village school, they intermarried. So what affected one person affected a whole community. So in that sense, very tight, yes.
Towns and cities in the northeast, while geographically larger, can still be broken down into tight-knit communities. Whole streets of men who worked together would have joined the forces together. Shipyard and mine workers making PALS battalions. This swelling of the army is memorialised in bronze in the centre of Newcastle.
The Chamber of Commerce in 1914 really rallied to the cause and ended up asking all of its members if they would encourage their employees to sign up for this incredible challenge, I guess it was seen at the time. Everyone thought it would be over by Christmas, how wrong they were. But actually the way that Tyneside businesses did rally to the cause was incredible. So within a week they'd raised a company, but actually fairly shortly thereafter it ended up being 3 battalions as well as that company.
But it actually represents the call to arms of Newcastle citizens, and they call it the Response Memorial, and it's a response to the actual outbreak of the First World War and the citizens of Newcastle forming into the local regiments, and this represents them marching from their barracks down from Gosforth towards the central station and off to war. It probably represents thousands upon thousands of armed soldiers from the northeast of England and what their families went through. And obviously when you see the children amongst the sculpture, it brings the whole family experience of that event to your mind.
The history of honouring the dead and of memorial building is as old as time. The ancient Egyptians, Romans and Greeks all sought to display their power and triumph through memorials to great victories, great leaders and to empires now long gone. By displaying a public monument, you were making a statement about status. In ancient times, this could take the form of a simple block, something the Egyptians finessed into the obelisk, or the Romans into a victory column. The Greeks looked more to their mythology for symbolic representations of war, frequently using female figures to represent victory or peace. Statues of emperors, kings and military leaders were commonplace. With the Age of Enlightenment and the 17th and 18th century Gentleman's Grand Tour, where collecting ancient art and artefacts became an obsession, these monuments from ancient civilizations and their symbolism became part of the monumental language of Great Britain, something that was taken to dramatic new heights during the reign of Queen Victoria. In an age of empire and expansion, an age of industry, and for some great wealth, the urge to erect memorials became almost a civic duty, one tinged with personal and professional promotion, as statues of industrialists, politicians, and of the great and good, along with those of imperial military leaders, sprang up across the region and the wider country. In the newly created Victorian cemeteries, those with wealth and the desire to do so created memento mori on a grand and unprecedented scale. Simple stones for some were just not enough. The successful mining industry that the North East had long been famous for came at a terrible price. The coals that left from Newcastle and all along the coast were mined by men and boys working in appalling conditions, and explosions, accidents and tunnel collapses were far from a rare occurrence. Each time a catastrophe occurred, communities around the collieries were left to pick up the pieces, cope with their loss and carry on occasions raising a memorial to their fallen brethren so that those who chose to look as they passed by would know something of the true price paid for a warm hearth and the region's industrial prosperity.
Certainly some of the Boer War memorials that you can see in this area, you can see that where the First World War came from. You know, we've got the soldier at Blofeld, who is very distinctive and is noticed because it's on the main road to Newcastle and this sort of thing. But the fact that a lot of places in the northeast have Boer War memorials, small ones, yes, but they were paved the way for the whole idea of memorials. Before 1900, most memorials were to lieutenant colonels and people who had lots of money, had enough money to put into Durham Cathedral a memorial. You didn't get the ordinary soldier.
It is from this monumental inheritance that communities sought inspiration on how to honour not only their fallen, but also those that had served. Inspiration energised by what was happening on the now quiet battlefields with the shaping of the cemeteries, and also in London. The cenotaph in Whitehall had initially been intended as a temporary structure for the July 1919 Peace Parade and was made of wood and plaster. Edwin Lutyens, the renowned architect, who had already greatly influenced the design of the Imperial War Grave cemeteries, was commissioned just 2 weeks before the parade to create something as a focal point for the day. Symbolising an empty tomb placed atop a pylon, the clean and sombre design instantly struck a chord with the nation and was made permanent. Recreated in Portland stone and unveiled on Armistice Day, 1920.
What's important to note is that the unveiling of the cenotaph wasn't a self-standing ceremony in November 1920. It was a part of the return or the interment of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey. Now, at a local level, what you see is companies, communities, community groups, including churches, remembering the dead in their own way. And of course, the pattern would vary from location to location if we're thinking of community memorials, broadly understood village or town communities. It would depend on the balance of power on the committee that was organising the memorial. It would depend on the sensitivities of the neighbourhood.
The whole time the men were away, they were digging into their pockets to provide the soldiers with comforts. And when they came back, they were often given a badge or a certificate or something. Those who won medals were given things like gold watches. There were warship weeks. People were saving money all the time towards something.
There are all sorts of ways in which the dead can be remembered. It can be through the building of a public building, a village hall, a parish hall, etc. Communities, municipalities remember their dead, so do church congregations. It's quite possible for the same individual to be recorded many times.
I think first of all it was the chapels and the churches were wanting, and the schools were wanting to have a permanent memorial. I think it was that the smaller places that started first. Because of the numbers involved, I think everybody felt they wanted to do something. They had wonderful ideas. You know, when you read the minutes of some of the meetings that they've had, they all want hospitals. Well, that didn't happen. And the idea of having an enormous war memorial or a hospital just didn't. In most places, it wasn't feasible.
There were no official guidelines as to what form a community memorial should take. Towns and villages across the northeast sought their inspiration from the past, from their neighbours and from the nation.
They start going about 1917, street shrines in South Shields, August 1917. The first one's at Livingston Street. There were wood to begin with, and all it was the local people in that street would pay for a shrine, and it would be wooden, and it would be affixed to somebody's wall, often somebody who died, and next to it there'd be a little table with a tablecloth and flowers. And 2 or 3 times a week the ladies from that street would change the flowers, and sometimes they actually pinned the men's medals on the memorial. So they start by being wooden, And it's interesting because it's a case of keeping up with the Joneses, because after Livingston Street, next door, Headley Street, which is parallel with it, it gets one. Go up the street, heading towards the Roman Fort at Arbea, you suddenly get Fort Street gets one, Morton Street gets one, all that little area, and then it starts to spread elsewhere. So it's the low top area, the Roman Fort area at South Shields where these begin. And in total, as I said, there are about 20 odd of them.
The unknown warrior found form in the many statues across the region. Anonymous common soldiers, and in some cases sailors, who either stand in the sombre pose of mourning, or are alternatively alert and ready for further action in the defence of freedom. The image that these soldiers project is one of manliness, sacrifice, and comradeship. Anonymous as individuals, they do often reflect the area where they are sited, in the choice of regimental insignia that is cast or carved into their silent form. Sir Edwin Lutyens' cenotaph design was copied and adapted as local taste dictated, but the only North East Great War memorials that truly bear his mark stand in Northumberland. One near to Morpeth, the other a lonely sentinel looking across the Bay of Lindisfarne. As an exponent of the arts and crafts movement, which celebrates traditional craftsmanship and simple design, Lutyens was commissioned before the war by his friend Edward Hudson to renovate Holy Island Castle in the popular arts and crafts style. Renowned horticulturalist Gertrude Jekyll assisted with the castle's garden design, and also the garden of a Mr. and Mrs. Straker of Angerton Hall in nearby Hartburn. When the time came to commemorate the fallen of Lindisfarne and Hartburn, it was to Lutyens that they turned, with duplicate memorials following in 1921 and 1922. A simple cross echoing Lutyens' arts and crafts influences. 13 further examples of Lutyens' cross can be seen across the country. The Great War memorials that we see today mostly represent the decisions of small committees and the individuals on them. The size of the community, the personalities involved, and the available funds would dictate how the memorial would take its final form, and the agenda of a small village could be markedly different from that of a large town or city. Could the community afford the memorial it desired? Would that memorial be a simple scroll, or a roll of honour, perhaps a plaque, a formal monument, or something more practical?
Darlington lost about 2,000 men during the First World War, so it was about quite an average situation. In 1919 they held a public meeting, and the great and the good gathered, and they gave them 3 options about how they could memorialise the dead. And the first option was to build a garden suburb where all the widows could live rent-free. And the second option was to build a new town hall in the centre of town with a memorial hall added to it to keep these men's names alive. And the third was to pick up on the work of the Victorian Hospital Committee and build a proper hospital memorial committee. And it wasn't cut and dried, there was quite a close vote on it, but eventually they decided that they would go with the hospital option.
It came about by somebody, not quite sure who, probably the new rector, or the agent for Lord Boyne's estate, called a meeting and of the parish, and essentially the parish said yes, you know, we want a memorial, and elected a committee to go forth and sort it and report back to them. So I think that started in about December 1919 and went forward from there. Most things in a village like this seem to be run by a few. We have the agent for the estate, the rector. I think we probably had the rector's wife. We have one of the major farmers' wives on it. It's those sorts of people, people connected with the church, people connected with the parish council. But it got on and did the job, but it took quite a while.
Unfortunately, that then moves us into the 1920s when there is a severe industrial recession, and fundraising didn't go as well as was imagined. They needed something like £232,000 to get a proper hospital going, and they got stuck around the £80,000 mark, with people kind of forgetting about the war, forgetting about the Victorian times, and wondering why this hospital wasn't being provided on the rates, until really the Rotary Club stepped in and decided they were going to fundraise £10,000 to get the children's wing really up and running.
They had to raise the money, so first of all they actually allocated to each member of the committee an area of the village to go round and collect subscriptions. So that was the public subscription bid.
They were incredibly imaginative and incredibly vigorous as well. They even managed to build, all the Rotarians donated various planks of wood and bricks and things, and they built their own house, which they then raffled off. 12,000 people bought a ticket, and they drew the winning ticket out of a hat, and a councillor managed to win the house. But never mind, they'd raised loads of money.
They also asked people when they were collecting where they wanted the memorial to be. Did they want it in the church, in the churchyard, or in the village? And they took soundings on that front. That did not come up with anything conclusive. It was a bit mixed. But what did come across, and what was eventually decided, was that it should be the wishes of the people whose families had died that should prevail. And they decided they wanted it in the churchyard. The agent of the estate had a brother who was an architect, and they were hoping he might come up with something, but he'd paddled off to America, so that was no good. And they were, I think, groping around a bit to try and find a design, and eventually, I think, approached the person who designed the one at Sedgefield and asked him to submit a design, which he did. They actually had a mock-up of it in wood in the churchyard so that people could come along and see what it looked like. That met with approval, and so they went with that design.
The most visible of the North East Great War memorials are those that stand in the open air. Celtic crosses, obelisks, statues, and the numerous variations on the dominant themes. Stanley Crook in County Durham chose a figure of sorrow holding the victor's laurels, symbolising the cost of the victory. Alnwick in Northumberland chose a functional memorial. A lamp surrounded by not one but three figures, a soldier, sailor and airman, all standing still and silent, arms reversed in mourning for their fallen comrades. Stanley Crook's memorial cost £435. Alnwick's over £2,000. Rothbury in Northumberland chose a monument that was simple and practical. Not only did it honour the fallen, but it also included water troughs for horses, a useful addition repeated elsewhere. Major General Sir Percival Wilkinson, who had commanded Rothbury men at the front, should have conducted the unveiling, but unfortunately his car broke down, and so Lord Armstrong, who lived at nearby Cragside, stepped in. The memorial, costing £600, was unveiled on the 23rd of January 1921. Many North East architectural memorials will include an inscription of some sort. Of those that do, 62% are taken from Christian religious sources.
The thing to bear in mind is, of course, British society at this stage in its history, in the early 20th century, is a very much a believing society. It's estimated by religious historians that more than 99% of the population would have identified themselves as Christians. A far higher proportion of Britons were regular churchgoers, were far more familiar with scripture, with hymnody, with the basic tenets of Christian morality than we are today. If the religious symbolism used by the Imperial War Graves Commission, and indeed by the British state, had no resonance with ordinary people, it would not have been used. Remembrance has to speak to the loss, the aspirations, the needs, the convictions of those who survive.
If the chosen memorial design was to include names, the decision about which names to include could prove difficult, and today, researchers find it problematic to decipher the decisions made when the memorial was created.
There is a list, I think it's Pittington, Hogarth Pittington, there's a list there of the ones whose names are on the War Memorial, but there's also another list of about 6 who are not on the War Memorial. And it's things like his parents didn't want his name on, he had only been in the village 6 months. So the criteria, I think, for putting a name on a war memorial was very much up to each area.
In the records, there is actually another list called a Roll of Honour, a higher Roll of Honour and just a Roll of Honour, which actually lists the names of people who were killed, but also lists names of men who fought. And it's not complete. There were men who died who are not on that list and vice versa. And that was quite wide. It actually extended to the relatives of people who lived in the village. And I don't know who drew that up or where it fitted in a time scale. It was very useful for our research, but it didn't actually help us know how they decided what names. Clearly there were some people who lived in the village who died, and that was obviously straightforward. But there was one who I think was still missing, and I think perhaps the family didn't want to put a name up in case he might yet come home.
Most North East memorials were publicly funded, a monument or building for the benefit of a community created by that same community. Smaller, personal memorials, usually found in churches, were created by families who could afford to do so, honouring a lost father, brother or son. Those with greater power and sway made alternative arrangements.
The memorial actually came about from the Renwick family. George Renwick was a very prominent businessman on the quayside of Newcastle, and he actually sent off 5 sons to war, and all 5 sons returned safely from the war, which is a marvellous fact in itself, a miraculous fact in itself.
The Renwick family, who were particularly involved with the Chamber of Commerce, put up what was an incredible memorial at the time, and actually looking back now is an even more incredible memorial. And although it was done by them as the family, I think that we, the business community in the North East, saw it really on behalf of the whole of the business community, saying thank you not just to the individuals that fought, but for the businesses that supported that, because actually the amount of financial contribution and total sacrifice that many businesses made at that time, as well as what we know so much more about the individuals that went through, that memorial was a really fitting tribute to them. And of course, that saying at the bottom of it, not for self but for country, I think says it all.
Designed by Sir William Guscombe John, the Renwick Memorial, the Response, is arguably the North East's most well-known Great War memorial. Imposing and impressive, it dominates the green beside the Church of St Thomas the Martyr in front of Newcastle Civic Centre.
There may have been more of a political agenda. Obviously the North East played a massive part in victory in World War I, and I think it's which is quite understated that we actually sent 52 battalions of Northumberland Fusiliers off the war, countless battalions of Durham Light Infantry. We had all our coal mines in the North East of England, steel production, and without all of that industry and the women behind that industry to work in the munitions factories, we would probably still been fighting the war for many years after.
In the 1920s and later, small villages and towns across the region unveiled their tributes to the fallen. Some would be simple services attended by the local clergy and local dignitaries, while others would involve far greater pomp and circumstance.
Prince George, who later became the Prince of Wales, he came up, and they were very un-PC in those days. So the Rotary Club had got a 12-year-old boy called Raymond Feetham, and he's described as a boy cripple, poor fellow. And Prince George went up to him and ruffled the boy cripple's hair, according to the newspaper reports. So there was a huge gathering of people here. There were a couple of gantries erected, and so everybody watched as the ceremony took place. But it was both a celebration of the opening of the hospital, but it was also quite a sombre affair because there were ceremonies remembering the dead who were killed in the war before they left the cenotaph and walked over with their golden key and slipped it into the lock of the Bradford Memorial porch.
The actual response was fantastic because the Prince of Wales unveiled this memorial. The whole population of Newcastle came out on the streets of Newcastle to witness the event. In the morning before the actual unveiling, there was 42,000 school children attended an event at St James's Park, which was witnessed by the Prince of Wales.
There was a dedication service on the 2nd of June in 1921, and the reports that we have tell us it was a beautiful day, blue sky, cloudless, which was, I suppose, must have made people feel a bit better. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so all the children from the school would be able to come along. We had the Archdeacon for Auckland was here, and Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Bowes. And again, I think quite a lot of clergy, a choir, obviously all the mourners, and I think a lot of other people as well. Yes, quite a significant occasion.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street.
Soon after they had been unveiled, many of the memorials to the Great War would see themselves have to evolve to accept the unthinkable. And the Great War was rebranded as the First World War, accepting the ongoing nature of conflict and the added names from the 20th century's second global inferno.
For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war.
Times moved on, and the communities that built those original memorials aged and died, leaving these monumental clues to our past.
Our role in life is to record war memorials. As many details as we can find out about them, when they were consecrated, when they were anything that's happened to them, where they've moved to, anything about them, and to make that information available to the public, and that is normally through our website. First of all, you can search by name, so that you put your surname in, and you can find out on which memorials in the North East, out of our 4,500, that surname is mentioned on. It's then up to you to use your family knowledge to home into the villages or the towns where they were. Always remembering that in Northumberland, well, especially Durham, villages are cheek by cheek, you know, so that you can be actually born in one village, go to school in the next one, and work in the next one. So you have to think about the area.
The names carved into local war memorials would have needed little or no introduction to those that built them. They were their neighbours, their relatives, their friends. Now, nearly a century later, those names and the memorials that contain them require research and renewed understanding. The members of the North East War Memorials Project work tirelessly to ensure that the region's monumental past is understood, preserved, and not forgotten.
I think it has to be said, if Janet hadn't done the work that she's done and the amount of work that she's done, the North East War Memorials Project would never have been anything like what it is.
It started because there was a letter to the Times from the man who was then head of the Imperial War Museum, suggesting that whilst war graves had always been listed, war memorials hadn't, and he thought a little list would be a good idea. We record all the war memorials that we've found. Sometimes they're still standing, others have long since gone, particularly the ones in buildings that have been closed or demolished. Some people kept their memorials, others just destroyed them.
Everybody walks past a war memorial, but do they actually look at the name? Who that person is, what they actually do, what was their job, what church did they go to, what school? The questions you get asked is what happened to him and where was he based or where was he served and how did he get killed? Well, you can't always tell the people how they got killed because it's not always recorded, but you get a rough idea sometimes, and it can be very moving. It can be very moving.
It all started initially because I started to research my family history, like lots of people are doing these days. And I was looking for different family members and their names were appearing on the North East War Memorial Project site. And my great uncle, who served with the Tyneside Scottish, he was on a local memorial and none of us knew, none of the family knew he was there. So that was the first time I'd encountered them and the interest was first sparked, if you like. And then as you go further into it and you read newspaper articles, then you see the friends who they fought alongside and it all becomes a bigger picture.
I personally love newspapers and you get the feel of what was happening at home. I am a local historian and I want to know what was happening with them.
The detective work involved in researching names and memorials is hampered by the passage of time. What once seemed permanent was anything but, and memorials are lost as buildings are lost. They move location and can offer more questions than answers.
This is a memorial to the employees from the Cooperative Society throughout the country who died between 1914 and 1916 in the First World War. When they relocated the shirt factory, which was the last co-op building in Pelo, to Washington, I approached the manager and said I would be the temporary custodian and hopefully find somewhere where we can be displayed. Obviously, when buildings get pulled down, companies move, you know, it's a fact of life that certain things go missing, you know. So all I've tried to do is just take care of it until, as I say, I find somewhere to display it.
In the early days of war, as communities waved farewell to Kitchener's volunteers, people would have had little concept of what their men faced abroad, and even less understanding that what they faced could also be faced at home.
Guns from 3 German warships about 3 or 4 miles offshore. About 2,500 to 3,000 shells fell on this tiny part of Hartlepool. The shells that the Germans were using were delayed action fuses, and the trajectory couldn't come down low enough, so they were actually overshooting the target, and they were killing people half a mile to 2.5 miles away.
Hartlepool on the northeast coast had been chosen by the German Imperial Navy as a target, along with Scarborough and Whitby, in order to draw out sections of the British fleet, testing the water. The effects of the bombardment have echoed down the century.
Some of the families, 100 years later, are still suffering the effects of what happened, because there was 4 or 5 people in one family killed, and those memories never go away. They decided they wanted to build a memorial to what happened to the civilians, because we've got behind us, we've got the memorial to the war dead, but that's the armed forces. But for the civilians, unfortunately it took 100 years for us to get the new memorial. Every person who lost their life was part of history, and their families are also part of history. And we should never forget.
As the centenary years of the First World War approached, individuals and history societies began to take a greater interest in their local war memorial, using them as a source of information, leading to greater research on the internet and in local archives. Names and life stories that would have been familiar to the local community were lost over time, only to be rediscovered by the new members of those same communities. But now, a century later, what do these memorials mean to us?
I think if it went, people would be mortified. So they would notice its absence. How far they notice its presence, I'm not sure. There's a good turnout every Remembrance Sunday and people lay wreaths, so in that sense it commemorates. Possibly more in recent years with our troops fighting abroad as well. I think certainly with all the events that have taken place to do with World War I and the things we've done in the village, people have, I hope, looked at it afresh and learnt something of its history, and so it's a little bit more meaningful. One interesting thing, we were actually contacted by the family of one of the men named on the memorial, and they're scattered around the country, but 3 generations of them came up here for the remembrance service in 2014 and laid a wreath, and it was important to them to come.
We just hope that the war memorials are kept forever, not defaced or vandalised, kept maintained, looked after, and people do respect what they are and what they do. Everybody should be aware of where their war memorial is, and they should look after it forever.
Something really fundamentally different happened in the First World War, and therefore the way that we've commemorated them since, because after all, Second World War memorials tend to be actually affixed to First World War ones. And then even now, I'm conscious that there are 1 or 2 places where people who were killed during Iraq or Afghanistan, the way that different communities have wanted to portray that.
Darlington as a town is very wedded to its memorial hospital. Every time the Echo has stories about the possibility of downgrading of services moving out, there is a barrage of opposition because it is still the town's hospital, and that's a legacy both of the industry and also the connection with the men who died in the First World War.
I think it's a memorial to the spirit of the village and the spirit of the age and what the village contributed to the war. It's a memorial to the way a small community did actually come together, raise the money. The estate stonemasons carved it, the local people paid for it. Lord Boyne gave the stone, it's local stone. So it is a memorial for the whole village, I think.
A war memorial is a time capsule into the past, and I've done quite a bit of research just on a small war memorial with 27 men on, and I've discovered some amazing stories of sacrifice, heroism, tragedy, and it gives you an insight into that part of life. It is 100 years ago, but it's not that long really, because I've talked to, I've actually talked to one or two daughters and sons of veterans of the war, and I've talked to grandchildren and so on, and it does very much touch families still today, and families have got a good sense of pride of what their fathers and grandfathers and uncles went through.
A lot of those names are still represented in the villages, the communities. They did sacrifice their lives for us as our generation and the generations to come. We need to remember that, and I personally believe that they're not just lists of names. They were people, there were men, there were young men. Some of them were rogues, must be admitted, but they were willing to do it, and they did it for a better country, and we have reaped the benefits and continue to reap the benefits.
I think it's really hard for us now to really understand what it was like in 1919, 1920, after that conflict, where the scale of the suffering, and you look at some of the maps done today which show that almost every single house in every street had lost somebody, and when a whole country has gone through that amount of pain and suffering, the sort of way of coming to terms with that has to be to look towards something greater and put it to something else. So I think that we, looking at it now, sort of struggle to come to terms with the way that patriotic emotion sprung forth. But it was a way of really coming to terms with what was so huge. It was beyond a level of suffering that people had understood before.
Every name on a memorial tells a story of a real life altered and, in most cases, ended by conflict. In a few fortunate communities, their memorial tells a different story. One of overwhelming gratitude for the men's safe return. Hunstanworth in County Durham and Meldon in Northumberland earned the rare title of Thankful Villages after all the men they sent to war returned home safely. Across the country, there are only 53 such places, Meldon being the most northerly in Britain. There are none in Scotland. The Great War memorials that stand amongst us, silent and dignified, tell their own story. Not just of the names upon them, but of the communities that built them, and of the communities that inherit them.